And we're being recorded, so for the task force members that couldn't make it today, they'll be able to watch this later. Just a few things from last year that we've got some updates about. So the +1 ADU grant window has closed. December 13th was the deadline for that. REPCO, as we know, is running that program for a variety of counties. So they've received all the applications they're going to receive. As we knew from the amount of money that we got from the grant, which was $2 million, doing the math, that works out to about 14 projects that we think we'll be able to get done in Columbia County, and we received over 40 applications. So we were well oversubscribed. They're still going through and scoring the applications just so that they meet the minimum criteria. And then we'll be able to review, if there are more than 14 after that, then we'll be able to review them as far as the competitive portion of the application process goes. So hopefully that will all be done by the end of this month, and then contracts will be entered into sometime in February, and then construction can start in the spring and early summer. On the topic of grants, other grants that we applied for last year were the Community Development Block Grant Community Planning Fund. So that was $50,000. What we were going to use that for was a windshield survey of existing conditions throughout the county. Then leading into this year's application for the single family rehab program. We unfortunately were not awarded that grant. We have I like to call them postmortems. I don't think that's what the state likes to call them, but we'll find out where the grant or where the application needed a little more help, where it was deficient. The hope is that, you know, the application and the project still can stand on its own, and it might have just been a really competitive round, but we don't know yet. So we'll find out in a couple of weeks. Similarly, we applied for the we applied for 2 manufactured and mobile home replacement programs. We're not awarded either of those, but again, you typically don't win these the first time you apply for them, and that program was very competitive this year. That interview we'll have next week with Homes and Community Renewal to find out, you know, how to strengthen that application. And again, we'll apply this year once we find out how to have a more competitive application for 2025. I think that's it for the grants. Yeah, that's it. So the land bank is applying for its capital funding this month. So that'll be the way that our land bank works out, given its size. That'll be an operating budget of about $500,000. And we've already talked to a couple of the towns that have properties on the upcoming foreclosure list. There should be an auction sometime in spring or early summer. So we're in conversation with the towns that have properties that the land bank board is interested in. Okay, I'm going to start sharing some things. I don't know what order I'm going to do this in, so bear with me. Oh, please share. All right. The problem is I can show these in the room. I don't think this Mac is going to allow me to share things on Zoom. Let me see. Ooh. Nope. All right. Really dislike this Mac. All right, so I'm going to tell you some things. You'll just have to take my word for it. Do I want to come back to that? Are you able
to share screen, Chris?
Yeah, because Mac doesn't like to share PDFs for some reason. So I'm going to start with the most recent news. So Governor Hochul announced a bunch of strategies today with not a lot of details. So this is kind of part of the lead up to the state of the state. So these are I think it's 5. Again, it's brand new. Yeah, 5 or 6. So these are either new or kind of reimagined strategies coming out of the governor's office. The first one that they hit was disincentivizing institutional investors from buying up 1- and 2-family homes. Dennis, I know that this has been a cause that you've kind of raised the flag about a few times. Not included, well, nobody can see this except for me. So not included in the notes that I'm looking at, but was included in the governor's release by the year 2030, which, you know, 5 years away. It's projected that somewhere between 30 and 40% of all single and 2-family homes in the country will be owned by basically investors, not, you know, first-time home buyers, or as the case may be.
Sorry, say that percentage again.
Between 30 and 40%. So the governor has, and again, there are no details on this, so I can't answer any questions except for where did you find this? There are some disincentive strategies that they're pursuing to basically disincentivize institutions and LLCs, private equity investors from purchasing up the homes and flipping them. And they have to do, there are a few details in here that have to do with rewriting some of the tax code, and then denying them certain interest deductions, and then certain tax credits that they can currently avail themselves of. So that was the first one. The second one was to provide starter home innovation funding. So the governor's proposing $50 million in capital funding to incentivize the building of new starter homes. And this will include innovative approaches to home building, such as factory built and modular development, which is good news. We've spoken to quite a few modular developers who are interested to start building houses in Columbia County. So knowing that the state is going to be behind that, hopefully we'll be able to get some movement on the modular home front. Home buyer down payment assistance. This is kind of not new, but it just sort of goes into the tranche of activities here. $50 million in new state funding for down payment assistance. This one is, to me, the most interesting one, creating an affordable home buyer tax incentive. So this sounds to me, and again, without any details, this sounds to me very similar to what Al Valencia from Habitat has talked about a few times. There was legislation that came out of Assemblymember Barrett's office that had to do with abating, basically, if you received a subsidy, that subsidy amount would be subtracted from your assessment when you pay taxes. But that was specifically for people at 80% and below of AMI. That's kind of tied to Habitat's service area as far as income goes. This, I'm not sure if there's an income level. It does specifically mention a local opt-in for homes built with assistance from governmental entities. That could be the state or local entities, nonprofits, land banks, and CLTs. So it's sort of narrow, but not super narrow. And then those properties, they would need to be sold to low and moderate income home buyers. Now, a strict reading of low to moderate gets you up to 80% of AMI again. So it doesn't have to. Sometimes they include up to 100% for moderate home buyers or moderate income. So again, we'll see when the details start to unfold exactly where that income level is.
Chris, can I ask a question? You may not know any details on that one, but is that credit in some way refundable from the state to the localities? Because I think there was already a provision that allowed lower assessed values or lower assessments by the localities for affordable housing, but they were reluctant to adopt it because they didn't want to, decimate their own tax base.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, localities can assess properties however they want. If they want to devise a local strategy to waive the subsidy amount when they assess properties, that's fully within the realm of a local assessor's purview currently. This just creates something that a local assessor or a local town board or common council can hang their hat on. Say, yes, we're opting into this particular state strategy. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. But Meredith, I don't know the explicit answer to that question.
I was just talking to my assessor actually about the real property exemption for ADUs and how municipalities should maybe look at codifying to ensure that that's not abused by people just looking to throw some money into the
Yeah, you got to make sure that there are some holes that people try to drive through. And then the last point from the governor today was strengthening laws and policies to combat home appraisal discrimination. This was the thinnest of all the information. I think I copied and pasted everything that was on there. Governor Hochul will propose a suite of actions to make discriminatory appraisal practices unlawful and enforce anti-discrimination principles in appraisals and diversify the appraiser workforce. So that was everything from the governor's office from today.
Chris, I just want to circle back to the investors buying homes, and you said they're buying and flipping them, but what we're seeing is that a lot of them are buying them and renting them. And so that is why why there's been fewer and fewer homes available to purchase. So even when they're renting them to lower income families, they're making profits on doing that. So I just want to make that clear. So
yeah, no, that's a good point. I think maybe we can expand what we call flipping to jacking the rents up. Supervisor Collins was talking earlier about manufactured home communities being purchased from kind of like mom and pop operations, and then the rents getting jacked up with no improvement in services. In a way that's still sort of flipping, you know, the ownership, it's rental, right? So the ownership is kind of the same to the tenant, but they're certainly paying a lot more than they were previously, if they can fully even afford to.
Right. It comes up in discussions about ADU law, in fact, because when you start talking about making ADU as of right, everybody has this impression that they're necessarily going to go to the targeted market, but you start to move investors in, and then that gives them an opportunity to buy a property, add a unit, and then, to your point, flip it, you know, so.
Yeah. So again, obviously no one on Zoom can see this, but so one of the pieces of legislation that we knew was still percolating, and this is not new, but it has a new number because it's a new session. So this is one of the pieces of legislation that Assemblymember Barrett is sponsoring, and has to do with the creation of a community housing fund. So we've already got community preservation funds at the state level. That has to deal with imposing a transfer fee or a reconveyance fee on properties that sell in a given locality. And then you take a portion of that fee, or all of the fee in this case, and you create a preservation fund that can only be used for, you know, basically environmental conservation. So the community housing fund is the same concept, except you create a local community housing fund instead of preservation fund, from which you can acquire property, build property, subsidize property, whatever the case may be. I took a little closer look at this, and there are some interesting things in this legislation that I just wanted to call out. First of all, so this top piece for the folks in the room, there's a bit on here that talks about assessment. So it says, for the purpose of calculating city or town real property tax liability for such property, and such property means property that buildings that are built or sold by the community housing fund or using community housing fund money. Only the dollar amount of any financial assistance for the purchase of a first home made by the city or town pursuant to this section shall be subtracted. So it's the same thing. You're still subtracting, you know, a portion of the property or of the value of the property from the full assessment, but it's in a bill about creating a community housing fund. So it has an alternate spot here. And it doesn't seem like the bill has been altered, but you know, the governor's announcement was early today. So I don't know if this bill will make it through with this included in it. It's right now, it's in one of the committees. I can't remember which one, Towns and Cities, I believe. But that might get modified. This part is really interesting to me because I've got some experience with community preservation funds. They run them in Massachusetts, and typically the way those are written, the imposition of the fee that creates the fund, it kicks in above median home sales price. So, you know, the typical example that we'd like to use here is if your median home sales price is $500,000, which is pretty close to what it currently is, somebody sells a property for 600, that delta of 100,000 is what you can impose the fee on. This says any conveyance of real property that exceeds $500. So I'm assuming that is written really generally and broadly at the state level, so that when you adopt it locally, it gives you a lot of leeway for where you want that cutoff to be. I don't have any recommendations here. This made my eyes bug out of my head that it was such a low amount, but just throwing that out there. So that exists. It is now, I think it's A1033 for the folks that like to go looking for state legislation. They're fun reads if you've got the time. And then there is a bit in here that speaks to the income level, which is actually quite a bit different than the way most programs work. So they define eligible individuals as anyone who doesn't exceed 100% of the income limits that Sunny Mae sets. So Sunny Mae is the state of New York's mortgage agency. They don't go by HUD's AMIs. They've got their own set of income limits. And there's only two categories that, well, there are four categories, but we only care about two of them. Columbia County is what they call a non-target area. Non-target areas are pretty similar to non-entitlement areas for CDBG programs. So there are some areas throughout the country that they just get CDBG money every year. They don't have to apply for it. It just comes into them based on certain factors that determine what those are. And I think the Sunny Mae target areas and non-target areas follow a similar sort of rubric. So for us, if you are a 1 or 2 person household, 100% of the upper, there's just one number. You can't make more than 84,000 and some change as a household if you're 1 or 2 people. And then the other number just covers every household that's 3 or more people. So if you got 3 people or if you've got 12 people, it's all the same number. And it's not terribly higher. It's not 6 figures. So the community housing fund says that you can sell properties to anyone who makes less than 100% of that Sunny May level. All right, those are just interesting things that I found in Assemblymember Barrett's legislation. I'm gonna move on to the next piece here. All right. So at the last meeting, we talked a little bit about one of my big white whales here, which is trying to get some kind of employee survey circulated throughout the county. The employer survey will be on our website tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yes, sir. I think what we're going to do is just going to, Survey Monkey will create graphs for you. So we're just going to have all the graphs up.
Oh, don't ruin it for me.
Oh, I know.
Suspense. Don't give away too much.
So yeah, the December meeting, we talked a bit about, a little bit about what the workforce is. You know, we're not technically the workforce housing task force, but I think that's pretty much where our focus is, right? We're not really helping folks, we're not focused on folks below a certain income level. That's not our particular, you know, bandwidth. And clearly folks above a certain level don't necessarily need the assistance. So that kind of workforce, that missing middle of income is what we are shooting for. We spent a lot of time talking about housing for those people, and this is going to be a review for people on the policy committee. But we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about, well, what is the workforce? Who are we talking about? So I started pulling some of the numbers. This is a combination of census data and it's state workforce data. I can't remember the acronym. What is the NAISC? The institutional codes for different sectors throughout the state. I also want to look at the age of our workforce and what that trend looks like, and that gets really interesting. So from a really high level, in 2022, our workforce was just under 20,000 people. In 2017, it was just over 21,000, and 2012 was about the same. So from 2012 to 2022, we've lost about 7% of our workforce. Some of that is people leaving, some of that is people aging out of the workforce, some of that is just people voluntarily removing themselves from the workforce, whether they're retiring or just not looking for work anymore. But the number has dropped a fairly significant amount, 7% over those 10 years. And it dropped about that same amount, it dropped significantly less between 2012 and 2017. We only lost about 0.28% of our workforce those 5 years. What gets really interesting is when you look at the age of the workforce. So our workforce between age 16 and 54 comprises about 70% of our workforce, and 55 and up is close to 30%. That would be #1 in the state, except for the existence of Hamilton County, which is an outlier in almost every statistical category you can imagine a place could be an outlier in. Fun fact about Hamilton County.
What do you mean by
Yes.
#1, Chris?
We would have the highest our workforce would have the highest percentage of employees 55 plus in the state at about 30%.
Would it be seasonal or something? Someone was talking about that.
Yeah, I think it's controlled for it. So we've between 2012 and 2022, that proportion, and again, this is the proportion of the workforce that's 55 and up. That proportion has increased about 19%. So nearly a fifth of an increase in our workforce has become 55 and up. Hamilton County is #1 at 43.6. We're #2 at 32.72. Really big gulf there. Hamilton County is the least populated or the least densely populated county in America east of the Mississippi River. They're the size of the state of Delaware, and they've got 5,000 people. So we can call them an outlier. I included them here just for the sake of completeness, but they're a bit of an outlier.
Can we even call that statistically
It's
significant?
statistically interesting. I don't know if it's statistically relevant. So there are some nearby counties that are in the same boat, right? Essex County isn't, well, Essex County nearby, it's Mid-Hudson Valley. Greene County is not that far behind us. And then there's actually quite a bit of a gulf. So our workforce has aged significantly over the past 10 years. That rate of change slowed somewhat between 2017 and 2022. But the rate at which we're losing folks from the workforce has kind of stayed about the same.
Chris, can I ask a question?
Of course.
And I don't know if this covered it. Is the workforce comparable? Meaning, when we measure workforce, were we pretty much laid out the same in 2012 service?
We'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's coming.
Because that could account for some of the change.
Yeah, you'll see, and that'll be stuff that I don't think the policy committee has seen yet, so that should be news to everybody. I'm gonna skip past this text here because this summarizes some stuff that you'll see in a second. Where's my page 2? There was more to this. I'll just tell you what it is because I've got it off the top of my head. So the industries that we're gaining the most jobs in versus the industries that we're losing the most jobs in from a percentage basis, not from a pure numbers basis, but from a percentage of the workforce. The jobs that we are gaining on average are $40,000 per year. So the average wage works out to about 40 grand a year for the jobs that we're gaining. For the jobs that we're losing, the average wage is about $60,000 a year. So there's about a 1.5% or 150% difference, right? A 1.5 multiplier between wages coming in, wages going out, or the job wages going in and coming out. The interesting thing about that is that it is the exact opposite of what we know from Patterns report about wealth migration, where the households that are leaving the county tend to earn less than half of what the households coming into the county earn. Some of that has to do with where your income is coming from, right? If you live in the county, doesn't necessarily mean that's where your income is coming from. A lot of the folks that live here now, their income comes from the city. But it also has to do with what where is your income capital gains, right? Like what are your income sources aside from just where your job is?
So what would we figure if somebody was average median income, we figured this all right, even slightly below it at the height, what's it take to live in our county? Can you live in our county on $40,000 in a decent house?
Depends how many roommates you have.
So that's what I mean.
That's really the answer.
I mean, it sounds like we're fighting a losing battle.
Well, we're fighting a battle.
The boat's leaking. And we gotta plug, and that's not us, that's economic development.
The
If
job
I'm not
creation?
mistaken.
Well, so I've been rereading my Henry George. So it really depends on where you think wealth and jobs come from. So do they come from people that create the jobs, or do they come from people there that can do the jobs? I'll go off on a slight tangent here.
I love that.
So we know that we have one of the lowest unemployment numbers in the state, right? And that is cause for some celebration. It is also cause for some concern. If your unemployment level reaches a rate that's too low, you don't have a workforce there for people that are opening new businesses, right? There's no, if you're trying to open a restaurant and you need 20 servers, but your county is basically fully employed, it's really hard to open that restaurant.
I was following on WAMC, they did something, and we're actually at the point where we don't have unemployment.
Essentially, we're like in the margin of error for
Yeah.
unemployment, yeah. Most economists, some economists will tell you that
You sounded so confident.
Yeah.
Just keep going with it, will you?
but like between 5 and 6% is a sweet spot, and once you get below that, it starts to, some alarm bells start to ring. But it's still, it's good to have low unemployment. It's just at a certain point it becomes too much of a good thing. I found my second page.
Great.
So I was pretty close. The average wages of jobs that we're adding is a little over 40,000, and that's 20% of our workforce in 2022. And then the average wages of the jobs that are leaving is a little over or a little below 61,000, and that's 16% of the jobs. And then below that is a snippet from the pattern chart that showed the inflow and outflow of household incomes. So again, less than twice the income for the households leaving versus the households coming in.
It'll be more interesting to see the last 2 years, 3 years.
I know, I can't wait for the new data to come out.
I just can't account then for that statistic where we lead the state. I'll figure it out, but I can't account.
Well, for an older population.
Working lower income jobs, maybe
We don't
second
have-
jobs, maybe.
Clerks, cashiers.
Yeah, I suppose.
Tourism and restaurant jobs, like we've had a huge increase in tourism jobs that don't pay a lot,
And we
No.
think that age group's taking those 55 and up, and it could be.
I mean, it might not be one, but that's, yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be an interesting, I don't know if you can, I don't know if the data drills down that far. What's the average age of somebody who works in this sector versus this sector? You know, I don't know if I can get there, but we'll try.
I was just
On the
curious.
map, you can, but it's gonna be a huge margin of
We
error.
found them, yeah, the March.
I've noticed a lot of people, like even Harrington's, a lot of the people have aged out and they're coming back to work for,
Yeah.
for them, so they would then.
That would add to that number for
I
sure.
think there are
That number.
more than, I'm not that young. This will be the last full year that I can say I'm in my 40s. There are a lot of times I go into Lowe's and I'm the youngest person there. A lot.
Well, and that would account, yeah, I mean, that may well be what's happening.
Yeah, I think some people are re-entering the workforce maybe.
Re-enter.
So here are some of the numbers sector-wise. What I've done here is I've pulled out these are the 7 sectors that are the most, that contribute to the most employment. It's about 3/4 of all jobs in the county. And this basically has remained unchanged. If you look at the blue columns here, I'll explain my color coded. The yellow and blue are just a contrast. There's nothing special there. But if you look at the last row for share, we've been about 73% indeed for these 7 industries being the majority of the jobs throughout, the vast majority of jobs throughout the county. So that hasn't really changed. There's definitely been some movement within the individual sectors. So those green cells there, that's anything where we've gained jobs, whatever the time period is, whether it's between 2012 and 17 or 17 and 22. That's where we gained more than 20% in that category for that time period. Then the orange is where we've lost more than 20%.
So this would have CAS in it then, right? How many jobs did we lose when CAS moved down, or what was in there? But
Construction
this
is
was before this though, right? When you say manufacturing is 1,600 for 2022, that doesn't include the jobs we lost there.
because that would have been after, well, this would have been 2020. No,
That's a
2020.
significant number when you talk about this 1,600.
Yeah,
But manufacturing is actually gaining. Construction had an interesting bounce. So I think you can attribute most of the gain in construction. We're at 1,200 now versus about 1,000 in 2012. A lot of that is people rehabbing homes that they purchased, right?
Yeah.
And I think we have pretty much pinned that down. Not a ton of movement in manufacturing, not a lot, well, there was a lot of movement in retail from 2012 to 2017. Or excuse me, from 2012 to 2022, it jumped up 11.5% thereabouts. Is one of the biggest, so it's one of the 3 largest sectors. It employs the 3rd most people in the county in an individual sector. Educational services, by far the biggest loss. We have lost almost 1,000 jobs in the education sector since 2012. It works out to about 90 positions per year for the last 10 years. You know, some of that is obviously due to declining school enrollment.
I think it's downsizing,
Yeah, and a lot of it's
consolidation.
consolidating services in
Yeah.
schools, yeah.
Or attrition, yeah.
And attrition.
Well, yeah,
Healthcare and social assistance, and I'm gonna put a little asterisk on this when we get to the next piece. That's our largest sector currently at 3,700 employees. That share has been about the same since 2012. It spiked up a little bit in 2017, but it's remained somewhat steady. We had a huge spike in accommodation and food services between 2012 and 17, and then again, 17 to 22 had a smaller spike. But between 2012 and 2017, just a massive spike. And those are restaurants, hotels, actual bed and breakfast employees. I don't know if this accounts for the person that cleans your Airbnb between guests. I would tend to doubt it, but I don't know. And then public administration has again remained about the same. So all told, these 7 categories out of a list that's about 23 sectors long. So this is about 1/3 of those sectors, but that 1/3 accounts for 3/4 of our employee base and has done for quite some time.
Yeah.
I guess I just have to escape all the way out of this to get to my next page.
Does your construction, is that,
Did I hear you say agriculture there or not?
Agriculture, fun fact, agriculture technically, and I think there's a lot of wiggle room for how agricultural jobs are recorded. They have been consistently around 4% of the jobs in the county historically. Well, not historically. In the 1800s, there were a lot of more agricultural jobs. In the past 10 or 15 years, it's hovered right around 4%. Again, some of that is, I think, automation is a huge piece. You know, some of the biggest farms have the fewest employees. But there are a variety of factors. Again, these are just numbers. How we got to these numbers is a different set of circumstances. This is just where we're at currently.
It's a whole other discussion.
A big caveat about agriculture and its impact on employment is that it can't be judged only by who is actually farming. It's because agriculture is the component that drives tourists here. It's the component that brings weekenders here. It's the component that incentivizes people to build bigger homes here. So agriculture is kind of like our ocean, and we're like an oceanfront community. So it's if you only look at who's farming, I think that's a misunderstanding of what's driving the economy.
Okay, okay, far fewer colors on this one. This one's a little bit less interesting to look at, but these are the average wages for our top 7 sectors. If it's in green, which is construction, retail trade, educational services, that means that on average, those folks are earning between 60 and 80% of the area median income. If it's in blue, which is just accommodation and food services with an asterisk, which I'll come back to, that means they're making between 30 and 60% of AMI on average. So again, this is 3/4 of the jobs that exist in the county are earning below 80% of AMI, and a good chunk, because accommodation and food services represents a lot of jobs in the county. Those folks are actually low income, so they're between 30 and 60% of AMI. Healthcare and social assistance, I have to break that out a little bit. It's hard to get numbers for that for some reason. The census actually breaks this out a little bit. So there are kind of 3 categories to it. One is what we'll call, actual doctors, not to disparage anybody that works in the field, but those are like your actual providers. I can get median income data for that. I can't get average, so I apologize. I'm working on that. That's about half of the jobs in that sector. So about half of the healthcare and social assistance sector is actual practitioners. Their median income is about $93,000 a year. So those jobs are paying pretty well. The other half of that sector are tech people and then support staff. The tech folks make on average $36,000 per year, and then the support staff makes on average $27,000 per year. So half of another one of these biggest sectors, both of those categories would place you into the 30%. Actually, one of those categories would place you below 30% of AMI, which is now you're talking about very low income. And then the rest of those folks would be in the 30 to 60.
Chris, if you remind, it's like 71.5 or 72. What was AMI most recently?
In that area.
For one person, 100% of AMI is, I believe it's 86.
Oh, it's that
last year. Yeah.
in
So
Columbia
then,
County.
yeah. For 4 family, it's 106,400. That one I can give you off the top of my head.
Yeah,
But I believe one person is 86.
So it was
there's a reason we're askew, right? And if we take a look at this chart, you're not making it there.
Right.
Right? We're talking about the percentage you are under AMI when we look at our bread and butter. This is who we are. So something is skewing this. And it's the same thing maybe that skews the housing market. Something's going on.
Well, I mean, it's,
Demographic.
yeah, it's, when you have data that skews in that way where your mean is so far below your median, it's because you have so many people above, right? Because that's just counting, right? So there are so many folks that are above that, or where they are above it is so far above it that it
And I
skews.
think that's more what it is.
And I think where you see that displayed the most prominently is, in like Hudson, I think is probably the poster child for that. So it's a city whose, everyone's AMI in Columbia County is the same, regardless of what town or village or city you're in. The average wage in Hudson is $15 an hour, $16 an hour.
That's pretty low.
Yeah, so you're talking about $32,000 a year. That's the average wage for the whole city, not for certain sectors. Anyone that works in the city, when you add them all up and divide the wages and the time, it works out to about 30 grand a year, which is, close, a little more than a third of what the AMI is.
Yeah, like I think if you're charting the median income, it's not like this group is like, you know, this many in this group, this is like an opposite bell curve.
Exactly.
We have a lot of low, not a lot in the middle, and a lot of not very high.
Yeah, that's exactly what it looks like.
Chris,
That's
is there,
all I have to share. We can see everybody, we can see you all now. We couldn't until now.
is there any indication of how long people stay in the county in these different sectors?
No, I did, Dennis, I did look this up because I think there was something where the average, we'll just name the elephant in the room. Me saying that I wanted to start with Walmart for the employee survey, a lot of people had a lot of feelings about that. I've had a lot of conversations about why I wanted to start there. Why I wanted to start there is because that's where Walmart, Lowe's, Hannaford, Price Chopper, these are places that have really high concentrations of certain income levels, right? So these are places that employ a lot of people. Those people are likely to not live in the county, or if they do, they're having a really hard time making ends meet.
I need to apologize because I think one of my residents made a rather insensitive comment at the last.
Well, you know. So the average Walmart worker stays at Walmart. Dennis, you gave me this number, I think it was 5 years. Nationally, this is really interesting to me. Nationally, the average employee stays at a job for 4.1 years. So our Walmart workers are actually longer tenure. And I think there's a lot of reasons for, especially like in retail and food services. Some of them are high schoolers. They shouldn't expect to stay at that job for 5 years. Some of them are college students. They shouldn't expect to stay at that job for 5 years. So there's a little more mobility. I don't know how to, it's an interesting question, Dennis, because I don't know how to really get at it, right? Like, if you're a teacher, are you more likely to stay in your position longer than a hotelier? You know, that's really interesting to me, and I'm not quite sure how you can get at it unless you do an employee survey.
No, yeah, no, I understand. I was just, and this conversation is really mission focused. I mean, I think that if we're a housing committee, you know, isn't it appropriate for us to define the mission? And the question is, you know, in Columbia County, what group do we feel we must focus our attention on first? And what are our goals for that group? So I've heard from a lot of supervisors that their concern is they don't have an opportunity for a workforce to settle in. In other words, families to stay, to raise their children here, to take, you know, bring to their schools, you know, so that what they're afraid of is that they're getting a lot of transient people coming and going and not having enough opportunities for housing and other amenities to have people, you know, find Columbia County a place to stay and settle into. So I that's the only reason we had this back and forth, is because I feel like we might want to consider, you know, creating a mission statement for the kind of housing we're going to be producing, because, you know we're not going to be producing 1,000 units. So what's the goal of the first 100 units?
I mean, that kind of runs it. So the housing task force is not going to create any units, right? But obviously, I know what you're saying. Like, what are the cohorts that we want to focus on? I don't know that. I think I would be overstepping my bounds if I suggested to the Board of Supervisors, here's what we're going to focus on, right? So yeah, I think that's a conversation that we need to have more at the County Board of Supervisors level, maybe in the committee meetings. So for pure transparency, I push back at deciding from the top which jobs we think are valuable and which jobs we think aren't. My take is, if a job exists in the county and someone's working that job and you're working in housing, they're part of your constituents. Now, who you prioritize, I think that's an interesting question. But I think everybody that has a job in the county, and every job that needs to be filled in the county, represents someone who's a constituent of the housing conversation at large.
Absolutely. To be sure, I was not putting a value on what people do, because, you know, people are all valuable. I was just saying that what you just said, you know, that it might be interesting to hear from supervisors what their priorities would be, knowing their constituents, knowing where the economy is struggling, what jobs are, you know, as you said, the most jobs we're losing are 60,000 and up, right? So how is that impacting the community, you know? So, I mean, I think that is not to put a value on what people do, but when you know you can only supply so many units at first, which is going to have the biggest impact for these different towns and what they're suffering from.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's another, this hasn't really come up yet, but there's an interesting part here where I think the gap that we have is like jobs that pay between $80,000 and $100,000. I think a lot of the people that are in those industries can get paid more by going to work for the state or going to work for the SUNY systems or going to work for the schools in the, you know, the capital district proper, not what PSD considers the capital district. And our employers just can't compete with that. You know, it's hard to pay a teacher $65,000 their first year at a school that has an enrollment of 120 kids. You know, it's really difficult to do, but it's really easy for the state to do that.
Right, which is why I wasn't suggesting you focusing on the cost, but I mean, we know that we have post offices that can't get employers, you know, employment. So, I mean, these are essential, and that's why one thing to maybe consider is to define the essential workforce. You know, if you don't have emergency service providers, you cannot have a sustainable community without emergency service providers. And they don't have emergency service providers in the rural parts, and they don't have people to work in their post office, and they're losing people, you know, working in their municipal buildings. So it's a matter of, it might be worth considering asking the supervisors what are their essential workforce, because HUD does provide, you know, that kind of distinction for communities. They help people define their essential workforce so that they can target that for the housing developments.
Meredith, did you have a?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, kind of supplementing this discussion, you know, another takeaway is it's clear that with most, you know, kind of workforce housing programs focused on the 80% of median, that doesn't even get at our actual workforce. It's too high. And so, you know, kind of the subsidies that we need are much greater to reach the, you know, kind of the wages that people are making in the county and provide housing for them.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of, right? Go ahead, Dan.
I come at it from a different angle. From my perspective, what we know for sure is there's a shortage of housing at every price point. So we know that Section 8 is, I don't know, 3 years out, Bob. We know that people making $15 an hour are going to have 3 roommates in order to survive. And we know that somebody making $80,000 a year isn't going to be able to buy, you know, the starter home in this county. So from my perspective, we need houses everywhere. And I'm not sure we prioritize for a section of a workforce. If we only had 100 houses to build, you know, who are the people? How do we decide that somebody is more worth our effort for the building of 20 more units than somebody at a different social economic strata? So I would say, you know, from my perspective, what we need to do is focus more on getting as many units built as possible across the entire price point, across the entire spectrum. And that really should be the focus. That, to me, is the mission statement.
I think there are some cues that can be taken, right? So there are programs out there at state level that some of our municipalities have adopted that do offer things like abatements for first responders. I've seen other municipalities actually, I've seen free down payment for teachers because they're trying to get teachers into their communities. So there are some creative things out there, but you know, you're really just shuffling money around. So at some point you need to figure out how you make up the gap that you're subsidizing. Some of it's going to come from the state. You know, the community housing fund is a really interesting idea. Someone sells $1 million house, does 1.5% of that sales proceed help create affordable housing for folks down the line. I think that's a really interesting concept.
My comparison would be that I think we compare to resort communities, because if you look at places like Aspen, Colorado, where they have a lot of people coming and going, but what they have ended up as a result is the majority of the lower income workforce commuting in or living in, really horrific conditions. And so what they had done is focused on what they would consider their essential workforce, which includes doctors. And they've been helping doctors, find housing and subsidizing housing for doctors. So I think it's just to say that we're a county that is similar from my point of view, is similar to that type of county. It's a specialized area to live in. And I think that we have a unique set of housing needs, and that's all. But the supervisors know best. That's just my observation.
Yeah, I think my sense, and again, I've only lived here for 2 years, and before I lived here for about 8 months. My sense is that the county wasn't always like that, and it wasn't that long ago that was true. Right? That this resort concept of the county, and it's not just us, it's Dutchess County, it's Ulster County. That's a fairly recent development. There's a pithy quote that I don't know who wrote this or who said it, but I really like it. It's pretty harsh. There's this concept of a 15-minute city, right? It's sort of, Hudson is basically a 15-minute city. You can get any amenity you want in a 15-minute walk. And the quote was, if you live in a 15-minute city, but the person selling you coffee has to drive 45 minutes, you live in a theme park. So it's kind of taking that resort to the next level. And I really like that quote, but it also really hurts.
Who are the monkeys in the theme park, I wonder?
Resort is not an aspiration, right? Not at all an aspiration.
Yeah.
You can
And
see
there was one concept, I forgot who did this in Colorado. It was a similar abatement scheme, where if you were a landlord and whatever portion of a property you own, they did it by square footage. Whatever square footage portion of a property that you owned, if it was rented out to somebody at certain income levels, you didn't pay on that portion. You didn't pay taxes on that portion of your property. So they basically took your total assessment, divided it by your square footage, said, okay, you've got an 800 square foot apartment as a part of this property. We just won't tax you for that portion of the building. And they basically did it to help. That was specifically for employees of resorts.
But would part of our problem be, and I'm thinking of you with your bell curve, we've got so many people that are at the very top, we've got a lot of people at the bottom, and the people in the middle are not that much better off.
Yeah, and in large part are leaving. And
We're just above the poverty level.
yeah,
Right.
so it's that between 100% and say 150% of AMI, it's still really hard. Well, from 80 to 150%, it's really hard to live.
Well, I wouldn't want to have your job. You gotta figure this all out, come up with solutions, man.
Before
you're 42.
I'm just here to give you info. You guys are supposed to tell me how to fix this.
Yeah. I mean, I will only say in defense of the concept of high income earners coming in, that's what keeps us from being kind of decimated the way that rural areas that are really rural areas, outlying rural areas not with striking distance of cities, are facing. So we have a housing challenge, but at least we've got income coming in that is being spent here, that is helping to support and keep alive a local economy if we can pay people enough salary and if we can provide housing for them.
Yeah, and I would tend to normally agree with that, but right now our sales tax revenue is on a downward trend. So that money is being spent, but where is it being spent? On what? If it's not, money is coming in being spent, but if it's not going into the local coffers in a significant way, then I'm not sure how much of a benefit it is. If you want to see a rural area that has had not had a high income, where I grew up is a census designated place. It's this little place called Pattersonville in Princetown. I think there are 24 solar farms that have gone up in the past 5 years because there's no one to fight it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of land and a lot of poor folks.
I think to Meredith's point, though, it's when you have the type of people that live here, you don't have to only rely on the state and federal sources to find solutions for this, because that is the benefit, that we do have those kind of human resources, and we do have people that are willing to go to go outside of tax revenues to help solve the problem. I guess you know, Kristen, you and I go back and forth, and this is my personal take, is that when you have people living and working here that want to stay and they cannot stay, they cannot stay because they can't any longer afford heat. I mean, just look at this week, right? You have people now facing a utility bill for a month that might be the reason they're going to have to move out just because of this one cold stretch. So, I think it's fair to focus on those people. I think it's fair to focus on helping those people with their housing needs before we speculatively build houses to help people move in. I mean, I personally think it's fair, but
Well, I guess, so here's where maybe there's some miscommunication. I want to be clear about this because I don't know if other people have received this the same way. Again, not going to Walmart to say we're going to build houses for Walmart employees. If you're at the income level where it's hard for you to stay here because of, and again, because of the individual bill, I mean, I've been there not really all that long ago, you're part of the constituency. So you're just building houses at certain price points. And you're like, okay, you're just looking at it from a price point standpoint, not from, we need somebody from this sector, we need somebody from this sector, we need somebody from this sector. It's just, is this what you can afford? Is this what's going to remove your housing cost burden and make it easier to stay here? Then that's what we want to build for.
right. And I didn't disagree with you. It was the message. It's the message.
I think shouldn't have starting with Walmart. It's just in public speaking, just don't. Just going forward, I guess, just good note for everybody.
But you did mention, and I think I do want to follow up. And I think it's I hadn't thought about this before, because they are an employer, there's some folks that work there. What's the percentage of those folks that live in Columbia County?
That's what I want to find out.
Because I do too.
Yeah.
And I can find out in my building.
Yeah, and I would like to find out if you do live in Columbia County and you're working at Walmart, like how are you living with, because assumingly you don't
Correct.
get paid enough to be able to afford
Correct.
rent or a mortgage on your own. What's your situation? Are you living with family? Are you living with non-family roommates? How many? What's the rent that you pay? These are all, I think, really important questions that we'll get at. Okay, well, this is what the price point actually is. Regardless of what, HUD or the state says, so this is what's affordable. It's like, yeah, but what's affordable for the people that are actually here, not the people that your formula says.
Yes,
And I think supervisors
the
owe it to their constituents. I think they owe it to their constituents. Yeah.
I think so too, because I think there's multiple variables at work here. Getting back to what Meredith said, that's not necessarily the only variable to look at. Is, well, a lot of people have migrated up and bought the houses because they bought the houses that a lot of the population I'm looking at wouldn't have bought anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out what happened in the last 20 years to prevent that group from simply sustaining their lifestyle in the jobs that they're in.
I mean,
So it's a different question.
So there's two sides to this issue broadly, right? I think there's two sides to the affordability of anything.
Right.
It's how much things cost and how much people make.
Correct.
Wages have largely stagnated, and they've been
Correct.
fairly stagnated for a really long time. We've had an explosion in housing prices, so
And
that
inflation
delta will
generally.
always get bigger.
Right,
Yeah.
and if you go back to example of the doctor who might make 90K or whatever, they probably also have a ton of debt.
Yeah.
Like also
Yeah,
a lot of
last
that,
year
that
was-
class is making that amount, has as much debt that they're paying for.
I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, that's kind of the argument, there's that 30% housing cost burden number, but that number was invented in 1965 and it was 25% then, and then it was bumped up to 30% in 1983. But what's happened since is childcare costs have exploded. Just the monthly cost of a car now, on average across the country, it's $700. Student loan debt has increased. So all these things have gone up, but that 30% number has remained unchanged.
Well, and I think those are the variables to be thinking about. So when it comes to housing, again, I think it is at every price point, to be looking at. And I think that's why we're a good group. We have diverse eyes looking at this thing, and these different groups are represented.
I mean, I'll admit there are some price points I'm fairly less sympathetic to.
I get that.
But they're way up there.
So what's the survey gonna look like?
But we'll be talking about that. We skipped an outreach committee meeting because of the holidays. We just couldn't get one together. But I think it's probably gonna
They're
take.
just not dedicated like the policy. We would have met.
It took 2 days off. It'll be.
mean, at the
Right,
average.
Michelle, we would have been up for it.
The
We can say-
interval-
we can say that now.
I'll make you a promise, the interval between the survey being complete and being made public will be much shorter than the interval was for the employer survey. But I'm really getting to, the questions that we ask are really important, but also getting a broad net is really important too. Like, I want it to be relevant and not just anecdotal.
Well, that's the thing, you gotta talk, I mean, it's tough to ask these questions, and then it could be tough taking the results.
Yeah.
You send it out and 100 people say, we want a house. We'd love to buy a house.
Yeah.
Where are you gonna put them?
I mean, if we get a lot of answers that are,
You're gonna go
well,
up to Chatham and say, you know, we've got this huge project, these could be, we guarantee it, people.
if we get a lot of, I
Imagine
want a
those public
2,000 square
hearings.
foot house on 5 acres, you know, it's gonna be tough to service. But I don't think that those will be most of the answers that we.
No,
I hope.
I'm curious to see how you, I'm looking forward to seeing a rough draft of the survey.
Yeah, I would like to have that done by the end of next month, and then a month of review, so we get it out in the springtime. I wanna try to get it before summer, cause I think once summer hits, like, there's just too much
And then
variation.
how you gonna distribute it?
It's gonna be a lot of shoe leather,
Shoe leather.
yeah, a lot of shoe leather.
And
mean,
I
I'm
do,
like,
that we need to talk about every house, you know, every level of house pricing, because people are house poor at all levels. You know, people are house poor at higher incomes and people are house poor at lower incomes, you know, because of where they have to live and where they have to work. So I absolutely agree that it's all levels. It's just the question is, you know, who is suffering the most and who can we help, you know, who wants to be helped, and how quickly can we get them help?
Yeah, no, I think it's very right.
because I'm getting back to this whole, now, we send out a survey. Is this a government agency? Do we have, I mean, okay, so every employee at Walmart, no, I don't want to say Walmart, but Tim Stalker Building Incorporated. All my employees say it's the worst place to work, we don't want.
Oh, we're not gonna ask attitudes, yeah.
No, but I'm just saying, you can filter down to where you can almost see that statistically sometimes. Is that foilable?
Oh, that's a good question. Technically, well,
I wouldn't answer it, I would find out.
that's an interesting question to ask me during a recorded meeting. So CEDC is a
I thought
public
you pushed the
authority.
button again over there.
Well, now I gotta think about it, 'cause
Like Nixon, the 19 seconds is gone. I don't know where it went.
Because we're not really like, you know, this is an appointed task force. It's not even a committee of
You're a
of
private
the county.
enterprise, right?
But I work for CEDC, which is a public authority, and all of our emails are technically foilable. If somebody who's on. Okay, good. Yeah, so all of our emails are technically foilable. So if it was an email, well, no, because it's SurveyMonkey, it's a survey. So
it's
survey
survey.
answers survey answers, I think, are exempt from that. But let me double check. I don't want to answer that for sure.
You can, identifying information is not, but like you can show like the general results and you can just aggregate.
Yeah.
You can't have identifying information.
Yeah, I mean, some of the, because that should have been an anonymous survey, the employer survey, and some folks decided it shouldn't be. And they just answered, I work here, here's what I do, which was interesting, but I think the employee survey is gonna have
I think you gotta find out.
more important data than the employer
Because,
survey.
I mean, how do you get, like, you're gonna, like Harrington, let's take Harrington's for example.
This got like 30 people.
Oh, at least. I've ticked off about half of that many. So, you're gonna forward it as an email to the human resource department?
Yeah, and I
Say,
think
could you
follow
get
up
this
with-
out to your people, or?
Yeah, and then I think for the
just
bigger
curious.
employers, I think you follow up with some kind of in-person event as well. So, you know, it's gonna be a lot of traveling, but hey, it's how we got the pro housing community thing done. So you just have to go places and talk to people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Or I
I
have
think,
to go
I
places.
think it could provide a lot of the information we're looking for.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Really do.
I gotta say, the concept of finding out, we know how many people commute into the county every day to go to work and how many people commute out of the county. It's roughly 50-50. What we don't know is how far they drive, how much they spend on gas, you know, would they rather live in the county than not live in the county? We just know the sheer numbers. We don't know anything about those people, and that's what I really like to get my hands on. Right.
Well, even pre-COVID, we had the pattern of progress of the out of alignment report, right?
Yeah.
And they talked about the number of children at an adult age that were still living with their parents, and it was staggering, even up to like 34 years of age. It's pretty nice.
I saw, I'm sure the commissioner, well, we were just talking about this last week. I saw a headline maybe a week and a half ago that across the country, homelessness went up 18.1% year over year. So we had nearly a 20%, nearly a fifth increase.
Yeah, so that was one of the feature articles 2 weeks ago, and then this past weekend, the feature article was the struggle of that age group trying to get out on their own, which just goes back to all the variables that are striking it. Well, I just think there's radical shift going in the United States writ large from a demographic standpoint, and everything's reverberating from that. So getting back to focusing on the different price points, we can say, well, we don't know about what's driving all of this stuff, but we do know that people working at these types of jobs, Walmart, Harrington, the hospital, they would prefer, and they can no longer live here, or they never could. And then why is that? Is that stock? Is it price? Yes, well, it's stock because that's driving up market rate and they can't deal that. You know what I mean? And drilling down in each price point, because it's gonna be a little bit different in every one. And I don't know. I mean, you're quite right. It's gonna be up to the elected officials, and they probably have a variety of populations they're thinking about.
Well, it's tied to the supervisors too. I mean, most towns, their only full-time employee is like a highway superintendent. I think that's broadly true. And when you see those job postings, they're not posted at a salary that people can afford to live in the county, but that's just the reality of what a town's budget is. It's really difficult. 10 years ago, they probably could have lived in the county on that salary, but it's not true now.
Well, that's
But
sort of what I mean.
look at the housing help, they could. I mean, that's the thing. If they could live on that salary, if they had housing help. I mean, we are working on something that would make a difference, So the son of somebody who works in the highway department could stay if he wanted to continue to work in a highway department if he had housing help.
All right, I got a little after 5. That's all I got.
Good conversation, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.
Everyone.